morning. We'd like to thank to all those who, from different countries of Latin America, the United States, and other European countries, are connecting to these events, advances, and perspectives of the carbon markets in Colombia and Latin America. In this webinar, we're seeking to show the leadership and innovation of the carbon markets in Latin America, highlighting the best practices and their approach as a model for adaptation or replication among countries of a region. These events will be streamed in English, Portuguese, and Spanish, and it is part of a set of webinars that were started on April the 30th and will go up until September the 29th of 2021, organized in the frame of the initiative between the International Emissions Trading Association, IETA, ASO Carbono, with the support of USAID and the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development. We'd like to reiterate the acknowledgments to representatives from countries who are joining us today, and we'll excuse Peru, who, due to agenda issues, couldn't participate. Likewise, in order for the translation of the events to be properly heard, we'd like to ask you to go to the toolbar of Zoom located at the bottom of your screens. There you can click on the interpretation icon, and then you click on the language of your preference, and you choose silence original audio. With this, you won't hear the interventions twice. Likewise, we would like to let you know that this event is being streamed through the YouTube accounts of USAID and on Twitter through the Páramos and Bosques of USAID program, to whom we would like to thank for their participation in this event. Without further ado, I would like to invite Luis Gilberto Murillo Urrutia, expert in environmental public policy, natural resources, and climate change. With more than 30 years' experience, Dr. Murillo performed as Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development in Colombia from 2016 to 2018, and currently he is a Martin Luther King researcher and advisor of the Environmental Solutions Initiative of Massachusetts Technological Institute, MIT, who will show us the current status of the carbon markets in Latin America, meaningful advances, and the future of the coal markets. Dr. Murillo, welcome. Milena, good morning to all of you, to all those who are participating in this important event. Special greeting from the Environmental Solutions Initiative of MIT, and in a very quick way, I would like to refer to some outstanding elements of the status of a carbon market in Latin America and the Caribbean. Regulated and voluntary markets of carbon play an important role for the mobilization of resources from the private sector to the achievement of climate goals established in the Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDC, in the frame of the Paris Agreement. And this takes me to a first point, which is that we are in the boom of carbon markets in which Latin America and the Caribbean have been exercising as a region a prominent role and of a lot of leadership. In regards to the volume in the voluntary carbon markets, transactions of around 1,300 megatons of carbon dioxide have been achieved. And in regards to the offer, 45% of credits in these markets come from Latin America and the Caribbean, which displays the dominant position of Asia as the priority region. It's very important. Leadership of Latin America and the Caribbean is linked to innovations in the region regarding the establishment of mechanisms of carbon prices, which in some instances allow the purchase of credits for the non-affectation of taxes. This has been the innovative case of the discount carbon neutrality mechanism developed by Colombia with the support of USAID and of the World Bank. Now, in regards to a second point, I would like to highlight that the demand of carbon credits is very dominated by Europe. In this case, 63% of voluntary markets of this demand come from this region. But there's no doubt that the main engine of the carbon credit demand in this stage is related to the increase of the climate ambitions of countries and to the establishment of zero emissions commitment by the private sector and enterprises, which is extremely essential. The third point has to do with clarifying that the demand reflects a preference for the climate solutions projects based on nature and which have meaningful environmental and social benefits in its sustainability markets. For instance, protection of biodiversity, protection and advances with indigenous African descendants. The focus of equality and environmental justice have taken a lot of power in this stage of the markets. In this sense, Latin America and the Caribbean are responding to this signal with very appropriate regulatory frames to adapt to the markets. From there, 50% of carbon credits in the region in the voluntary market come from nature-based solutions. And fourth, I would like to invite you to pay a lot of attention to the effects and impacts that the coming into force since last February this year of a core market of the popular Chinese Republic, the largest in the world, and also to the negotiation that will happen around this Article 6 of the Paris Agreement in the next Summit 26, which is going to be developed in Glasgow, the United Kingdom. And now to wrap up, it's true that innovations in policies and regulations and specific projects that are being carried out in Latin America and the Caribbean have given a leadership role with the creation and consolidation of two carbon markets. The region is facing challenges that it must overcome to really take advantage of the great opportunities that these markets of the 21st century provide. Some of these challenges are related to the establishment of robust and strict norms and very detailed regulations in regards to environmental integrity and in projects that are sustained in mutual agreements with communities. But what's true is that the region is innovating, and in this sense, regulators and public policymakers are advancing in the response to these challenges. But let's not let be me the one telling you, but the representatives from the regions, the one sharing with you the perspectives of these markets and the important achievements that they have and the challenges that they are facing. So, Ana Milena, I would like to give you back the floor so that we can continue to listen to our prominent panelists. Thanks, Dr. Murillo. Excellent appetizer to start this panel. We'd like to greet again people who have joined as participants and who are still joining us participants to these events. And we'd like to remind you that this event, without being reiterated, is being presented in three languages: Spanish, Portuguese, and English. And in order for your translation to be heard properly, we'd like to ask you to go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen. There you can click on the interpretation icon. Then you click on the language of your preference and you click on silence original audio. That way you won't hear the two voices of the interventions at the same time. Before starting the panelist segments, I would like to thank to the representatives of countries who are joining us today: Mexico, Chile, Brazil, Panama, the Dominican Republic, and Colombia, who from their management will let us know the challenges and opportunities of a carbon market in Latin America. In this first panel, we have Juan Pedro Ciarle, Chief of Climate Change in the Ministry of Energy in Chile, and Jose Francisco Chávez Luis, Technical Director Management of Climate Change and Risk Management, Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia. So I'd like to leave you with Luis Gilberto Murillo, who will moderate the different interventions. Thanks to Ana Milena, and obviously we have a very prominent panel, and we'll get to know the current status and the challenges of a coal market, and we're going to formulate a set of questions, a very general question for our two prominent panelists, and a second question in regards to the specific case of their countries. And I would like to start by Juan Pedro Cerrale from Chile so that he can give us his insight. And the question is, what is the current status of the carbon markets in Chile and what challenges at an internal and external level are they facing for the future in order to be consolidated, considering that their role with the environmental, social, and economic goals are extremely essential? And besides, we'd like to know what would be an appropriate path to design a regional market pilot based on the commercial or trade agreements as the one of a Pacific Alliance, of which Chile is obviously an essential part. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Murillo. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm very happy to participate in these dialogues. I think they are very necessary, knowing where we are as regional countries, especially if we belong to the Pacific Alliance. In the case of Chile, we have a carbon tax which is current in force since 2017. It's a tax that does not only tax CO2 emissions of certain industries, but also the global contaminants or local contaminants or pollutants that are coming from the emitter source. It's in force since 2017. It's been implemented in a successful way. We'll say that way. And by successful, let me define it. In terms of all the capacities that have been generated, everything regarding to measurement, reporting, it's all been done very well. It's achieved a very good financing for the state. Nonetheless, we believe that given, for instance, the rate of our tax, which is of $5, is a flat rate which is not to be changed in the future, is seen as a very low value in regards to, let's call it, I don't know if the social carbon price or if we're really internalizing the negative externalities of those activities that are emitting greenhouse gases. The first initiative I would say is to see if it is feasible to increase the price of tax in a sustained way for the future in order to get to the values that science is talking about. Is on 60, 70 or even $100 or even beyond. Maybe in the case of our countries, a value of 50 or $60 could at some point solve that juncture. So that's the first challenge. A second challenge that we have, also Colombia has it and other regional countries, is that we want to be carbon neutral by 2050. And in that path, we need to understand the role of carbon price in achieving that path in a more cost-effective way. So up to now, we do not know if in our case the tax can be that response or if it can support partially that transition. Clearly not as it is designed nowadays or with a value, but probably if we can change it in the future, or straightforward to go to a different instrument. We are going to hear from Mexico and from Colombia those examples that they have that are sharing with Chile, where we have a tax, but they've been also going more straightforward in a more cost-effective mechanism as the zero emissions. My personal opinion, I would like to be in a very similar situation as the ones of Mexico and Colombia, but we are in a different path. And to wrap up, in terms of regional market pilot, in any way, I mean, if it's not done through a emissions transaction system or compensation, it could be through Article 6. I think it'll be interesting to see it as a possibility of having some sort of regional club, for instance, in the Pacific Alliance, where we can implement pilot projects. So I will leave it up so far like this, Dr. Murillo, and I'm very glad to be in this debate. Thank you very much, Juan Pedro. And now we're going to listen to the answer of Dr. Jose Francisco Charri to the same question, and it is really the current status of carbon markets in Colombia. What external and internal challenges are you facing in the future for the future, and how do you pretend to consolidate them so that really that contribution to the environmental, social, and economic goals are achieved and consolidated? And the one of regional markets that I know that Colombia has had important discussions around that. So, Dr. Jose Francisco, welcome. Thank you, Dr. Luis Gilberto, and to colleague panelist Juan Pedro Cerle from the Climate Change Office of the Ministry of Energy in Chile, and Marco Redia, Chief of Climate Change and the Secretariat of Environment and Natural Resources from Mexico, who are joining us in this panel. It's a very interesting question, especially if we evidence what the evolution of this adoption of price fixation to carbon has been in Colombia. The first thing is that Colombia, from a creation, we're talking around 2004 and onwards, where the clean development mechanism arises as an option to the frame convention of the United Nations. The first initiatives appear in reducing carbon emission, and the first transactions and cross purchase are given in reduction of emissions, having this as a first approach of a of carbon market.
To reduce emissions and provide opportunities to reduce such emissions through several mechanisms. This happened together with the carbon tax. That is, the non-taxation mechanism came with a carbon tax, together with the possibility of establishing carbon pricing and pricing tons of CO2. So this began a new dynamic in the market, but this situation also resulted in a series of challenges, namely with the carbon mechanism in place in the country, there was a mismatch between supply and demand. That is, there's still a lot of work a lot of work to be done connecting supply and demand, and in thinking about how various mechanisms could create spaces or scenarios where these two groups, the supply and demand, can come together and we can make those transactions more dynamic. A lot of work also has to be done in improving the information asymmetries, and we believe that there are still gaps, for example, in knowledge on how to control emissions, how transactions should be done, how non-taxation should take place. Commercially speaking, there are also many difficulties in terms of those information asymmetries. And this goes together with a need to have more robust rules and regulations that, in addition to ensuring transparency in these mechanisms, can also facilitate or create the conditions so that these mitigation results are seen much easier. That is in terms of the market as such. And I would also acknowledge that we as a country have backed a nationally determined contribution that is much more ambitious at 2030, which leads us to adapt and adopt various strategies, one of those strategies being the carbon market. So we really have to look at how we can connect those strategies and carbon markets to achieve our NDC by 2030. Just some figures on that. Just in the carbon tax, we might be reaching at 0.2, 0.3% in accomplishing our NDC just through the carbon tax. And conversely, we must also adopt these non-taxation mechanisms, non-causation mechanisms, which could then lead us to maybe achieve 10 or 15 million tons in emissions reductions, also significantly contributing to that NDC. That might be 2 or 3%. So we do find many opportunities, but this also creates the need to work on regulations and to work on accounting systems and using a very robust system to achieve that engagement between the various actors. As the ministry, we at the Ministry of Environment in Colombia launched a strategy to make the carbon markets more dynamic that addresses those fronts and that would form part of the strategy that we are proposing for those challenges in future markets, particularly in Colombia. That would be it, Dr. Luis Humberto. Thank you. Thank you, Jose Francisco. And we're very happy to hear that we are also joined by Dr. Marco Herida, who is the General Director of Climate Change Policy in Mexico. And we would ask you the same question, especially considering Mexico's significant role. What is the current status of carbon markets? What kind of internal and external challenges are you facing into the future to consolidate such markets? And how are you considering the contribution as far as social, economic, and environmental goals? And lastly, would a regional market pilot program be one solution considering the Pacific Alliance? Well, first of all, I'd like to thank all of the organizers. Undoubtedly, this is a very important meeting. It's one of the key it's a key dialogue in moving forward and in these issues to determine what's happening and what might happen and how that all might happen. And this forum is really helping us in that regard. So I'm very thankful on behalf of the Secretary of Environment and Natural Resources in Mexico. I'd like to tell you that currently we are developing and implementing a carbon market in Mexico. This is in a testing phase. We're in the pilot phase, actually. The preparations and organization began in 2018 based on a modification to the general law for climate change that does include this kind of development, developing a carbon market that would begin with certain initial steps and that was formalized in January 1st of 2020. And it entails two phases. One phase, which is like the starting phase, the startup phase, as of January 1st, 2020 to December 31st of this year. And what we are seeking at this stage is to align and adjust and really understand
a partir de una modificación a la Ley General de Cambio Climático que considera este desarrollo, el desarrollo de un mercado.
We understand the main challenges around the actions to be taken and any recommendations to the system. So this first stage will ultimately end up being 3 years long, where the productive sector will also become familiarized with the mechanism, and where we are also seeking to find operational capacity as needed for true operation startup of the system. But again, this would be based on an adjustment to the law that did enable creating this program, this pilot program. In this program, we have the electricity industry engaging together with other industries and 16 subsectors that have already been assigned rights initially. How is our country diving into this? Well, first by making adjustments, by having the policy in place. We have an emissions registry that's been in place since 2015, and with that registry, we've been able to clearly determine who has a greater share at over 25,000 tons for this initial phase of the emissions trade system, or ETS, together with other sectors. Our country also began this work with a very important announcement in the Summit of the Americas on carbon, where various leaders in the region committed to a regional initiative to establish carbon pricing and to establish monitoring and reporting on greenhouse gas emissions, and to also regulate carbon markets. So we are taking those initial steps. We're at the initial phases towards that, and we are very open and willing to share any experiences that we've had. We have a consultation committee for carbon trade, where several industries are engaged, and where we are also including the academia and the social sector to provide recommendations and to see how we might strengthen this mechanism and how we might move forward into other systems that are in discussion today internationally. Of course, this platform is useful to us to provide these results, but also to invite you all, encourage you to engage with us, where we might learn from one another and look at the progress we've all made and see how that might be useful to others. Thank you. I hope I've answered your into some of the... Of course. Thank you. And it was a very clear answer and really interesting to hear from you and from all of our panelists in their respective countries. I'd like to now focus more on the specific context around the progress and challenges that you are all facing. You've been very great with time, and I thank you for that. And I would also remind all the participants in this webinar that you can also send in your questions via the chat feature. I'd like to go back now to Juan Pedro Sierra with this question. Chile is moving forward in defining regulations for its offsets, for its carbon tax offsets. What made Chile use this possibility, and what kind of timeline have you thought for that? What things from this model might have been adopted from the Colombian experience, and what might be adoptable in Chile, and vice versa? What could be adopted in Colombia from Chile? Thank you so much for that question. And to begin, I'd like to say something that I did miss in the first question, and that is that our carbon tax is part of the tax reform that was approved in 2014. So, as you might understand, it's quite difficult to make any improvements to the tax because it's under the tax reform bill or act. But we were able to introduce some modifications in 2014, one having to do with the threshold around the installed capacity for emissions, which also entailed incorporating other sectors. And that also addresses part of your question, Dr. Murillo. And the tax will be in place through 2023 for two main reasons. One will be to then introduce certain flexibility on the tax, which it did not have before. And maybe more importantly, it's also about incorporating non-regulated industries under the tax and under the emissions monitoring. So we saw this as a twofold opportunity. In terms of the Colombian market, I think to us it would be interesting to, for example, better understand the non-taxation mechanism. That is to see what the rationale is behind tax exemptions. And we would also like to look at the protocols for implementing offset mechanisms through the tax. And we would also like to see Colombia's experience and see what things might be done in Chile methodologically speaking, which might also be interesting. There is one point that maybe I did not mention initially, but our tax is an emissions tax. It's downstream, which maybe added some difficulty to the instrument because not only institutions had to be trained on implementing the tax, but also companies to be able to measure and report and confirm emissions. And today, we are having very interesting discussions with a technical team at a very high level. These discussions are being led by the Ministry of Energy to really understand what the Chilean strategy might be for economic instruments towards carbon neutrality. And I mention this because we understand that the tax is part of our policy, but there are other instruments. For example, there are exemptions in using certain kinds of fuels. So public policy has to be very consistent in that regard, and there we have a challenge. And it might be interesting to see how Colombia and Mexico are going about establishing these supplementary instruments for true implementation, and so that they don't get too tangled up. So I would say that would be it.
paquete de política pública que tiene que ser súper coherente. Y ahí hay un tremendo desafío y quizás sería interesante ver cómo Colombia y
Again,
cómo México
we want to be more
están
flexible and incorporate
haciendo, ¿no es
more
cierto?, esta
sectors in mitigation.
complementariedad de instrumentos
And
para
with
poder
the instrument,
realmente
with this
implementarlo
domestic instrument,
y
we
que
would also like to,
no se
of
traben
course,
unos con
leverage
otros.
domestic
Entonces,
mitigation, but
yo diría
also
eso,
look into
doctor,
the
porque
future,
básicamente
where the offset system
lo incorporamos por un tema de la flexibilidad.
could
Queremos incorporar
be
más
more
sectores a la
robust
mitigación y también lo que quisiéramos con este instrumento que es doméstico es aprovechar las capacidades de mitigación domésticas, pero también con una mirada
and could
a
better
futuro,
address
no,
Article
no
6
hoy,
and
sino que a
could
futuro,
better
es que este sistema de
and
compensaciones
engage
también
with
sea
the systems in
equivalente
Colombia and Mexico
en términos de robustez con lo que pudiera
so that we
implementarse a través de
can
Artículo
also start to
6
look at our
y
regional
tratar de
markets.
comparar la robustez
Ultimately,
de
I
lo que
think that would be
nosotros
really
tenemos con
interesting,
Colombia, con
and
México
that
y
might come
como usted
from these
decía en
conversations
la primera pregunta,
to
que me
start thinking
parece
about a regional
esencial
market,
que estemos
given
también
the
empezando a
diversity
mirar
of instruments that
a
we
un
have,
mercado regional. Yo creo que eso sería
and
un
seeing how we
interesante
might
resultado de esto,
harmonize the
cómo,
instruments
¿no es
and
cierto?,
harmonize
podemos empezar a
methodologies. I don't
pensar un
know.
mercado
I
regional
mean, I'll stop
teniendo
there.
la diversidad de instrumentos que tenemos y cómo llegar
Thank you so
quizás
much. Thank you
a
so much,
homologar
Juan
los
Pedro.
instrumentos, homologar
And coming back to Marco,
metodología, no sé. Pero ahí dejo mi respuesta a esa segunda pregunta.
I would ask you about the following. Mexico has moved forward in piloting an emissions trade system in the non-regulated market and has also progressed extensively in voluntary markets. That is along both lines. How has the Mexican government thought about making those two markets interact? That would be a very significant challenge. And what kind of advantages or disadvantages have you found by allowing for such interaction?
Bueno, muchas gracias por la pregunta, súper interesante porque nos pone justo en la
Thank you for your
interfaz en
question.
donde
It's super
tenemos
interesting,
que
actually, because it
hacer
does
un balance muy
uh,
importante
lead us to
respecto de cómo
really
podemos
think about how
fomentar
we might foster
el empleo, el desarrollo de proyectos de mitigación
mitigation project
en
development
mercados voluntarios
in voluntary
que
markets,
busquen
in markets that are
justamente hacer
seeking
uso, aprovechar
to make
de
use
alguna
of
manera
and
la riqueza
leverage
natural que
the
tenemos.
natural wealth that we have.
Quiero
I
decirles
would
que
say
nosotros
that
hemos actualizado la
we have
legislación nacionalmente
updated our
determinada en nuestro
NDC
país.
in our
Estamos
country.
buscando en
In
términos de
terms
generar una
of
plataforma
mitigation,
mínimo
we're
22%
seeking
de reducciones al 2030
to
con
have at
un
least
ámbito
22%
de
by
hasta
22%
Y justo
reductions by
precisamente
2030.
de esto que estamos
And
hablando,
all
de
this would
poder
depend
desarrollar proyectos, de poder tener
the subject we are addressing at this moment,
buscar esquemas de
the
financiamiento que
possibility
nos permitan
of
avanzar en
establishing
esta
market or
descentralización.
carbon pricing and
Esto
establishing
es
mechanisms that would allow us
fundamental
to
para la
move
mitigación,
forward.
incorporando y
Those are all
desarrollando
key
protocolos
for
de
that
mitigación,
mitigation goal. Looking at
esquemas a partir de
protocols,
los cuales
looking
tengamos
at
proyectos de
various
reducción de
systems
emisiones
through
que nos
which we might
permitan,
have
pues,
emissions reductions projects come
plantear por
through
un lado,
that would in
particularmente
turn
en
allow us to, on
temas
one
de
hand,
emisiones, como ya se decía o se comentaba, esquemas
on the
flexibles
ETS,
de cumplimiento, protocolos a partir de los cuales se desarrollen proyectos. Y esto lo
establish
estamos
flexible
valorando en un contexto más amplio, en un
protocols
contexto más
through
amplio
which
de
projects can be
cumplimiento
developed. We're looking
de
at
la
this in a broader
NDC.
context, however,
Nuestra NDC considera el sistema de comercio de emisiones como un
in
componente fundamental.
in
Escuchábamos la
compliance with our
participación,
NDC.
lo que decía nuestro colega de Colombia en el
Our
sentido
NDC
de un
establishes
porcentaje.
an
No
emissions
estamos
trade
valorando un
system
5, un
as
10%,
something key, and we
pero
heard this also from
participación
Colombia.
total
We are
en
looking
este
at
cumplimiento de
5
la NDC
to
con
8%
la puesta en
share
marcha de
total
este sistema
of the
consistente.
NDC
Estamos hablando por
being
ahí
addressed by
de 10 a
this
15 millones de
emissions trade
toneladas.
system.
Entonces,
We're
lo que
talking
estamos
upwards
buscando
of
justamente
10 to 15
es
million tons.
poder
So
desarrollar, incorporar
what
estos
we're
esquemas
seeking
ya en proyectos concretos.
is
Nuestro
to be able
reglamento
to
de
develop and
emisiones
incorporate these
de gases de
systems
efecto
in
invernadero
specific concretes.
define una
Our
parte que hace
emissions
referencia justo
regulations for
al
greenhouse
registro de
gases
estos proyectos de
do
mitigación
include
que
one
pueden
section
incorporarse a
referring
forestales,
to
agrícolas, en actividades
registering
primarias.
mitigation
Y entonces,
projects
justamente en este proceso,
where
actividades
primary
indígenas
activities might be
también,
included.
de
We are in
desde
fact at this
forestales,
very
etcétera,
initial
en
stage.
donde estamos justamente valorando
On this would also
cuáles
include
son
forestry,
los
where we
criterios,
are
cómo vamos a,
looking
primeramente,
at
hay que
what
decirlo
kind of
claro y
thresholds
decirlo fuerte,
might there be in
nuestra
place.
prioridad es cumplir con nuestra
And I do have to
contribución
be loud and
nacionalmente
clear about this.
determinada.
Our
Y
priority
en
is to
este sentido
accomplish
de eso
our
se basa
nationally
las
determined contribution.
actividades que vamos a
And that
realizar hacia el
is
2030
fundamentally
en el
based on the
sentido de
activities that
poder
we will be
cumplir con estas
performing
metas
through
y
2030.
adicionalmente
In accomplishing
podernos
those goals, and also in relying on other mechanisms such as carbon taxes, such as flexible compliance systems and offsets. So all these things are in fact what we are doing and assessing with our various industries and sectors so that this work can lead us to achieve our climate goals. Thank you. Thank you for your answer. And we're going back to Jose Francisco now from Colombia. The voluntary carbon market in Colombia has had a significant and outstanding behavior around carbon neutrality. And you mentioned this quite well. You pointed this out. The Afolu sector currently has the highest share of this market. What kind of things should be considered to drive that engagement even further? And what kind of effects would you see in incorporating that sector in tradable emissions? And how's that process going? Thank you so much. And really an interesting question, because you're really touching on something that's really important. And it's the importance of the Afolu sector in the country and how that can connect with innovation in carbon pricing and other mechanisms. Because there, Colombia will not only have the carbon tax and its innovative non-taxation mechanism, but will also seek out the option to move forward in developing new instruments such as an emissions trade system. Afolo is really important to us. It represents upwards of 56% of our emissions. This includes emissions having to do with deforestation and other forest issues that have been quite present in recent years in our agenda, and on which we have paid to which we have paid close attention. Under Afolu, the first thing we would have to keep in mind is that forestry does bring many benefits, many co-benefits for communities and territories. So what's important is to see how we might connect actions at the forestry level with the greater system, especially when associated with mitigation systems. So the first thing we have to look at is that to connect an ETS with Afolu, that would be quite difficult, and we've considered that in our system design. Because in order to connect or to have the companies connect under these emissions initiatives, there will be many limitations in terms of regulating the emissions from land use. That entails certain administrative and monitoring initiatives that can become quite complex. And we've also found a very important opportunity in the offsets program and how the Afolu sector could connect to them. And it would be mostly around the emissions from forestry that can connect to the trade system through actions that create carbon credits. Basically, these would be offsetting mechanisms, basically, where these offsets can be used in the trade system. So we wouldn't per se be regulating the activities in Afolu under the program, but we would be incentivizing certain actions in Afolu through mitigation so that they can add to the country's contributions or goals. So that system would allow for leveraging both opportunities. What's key here is to develop certain clear rules that would define what activities would be regulated under the trade system and how those offset credits could be used as part of its compliance under the system. And there, I would highlight that in any of the scenarios, when speaking of these forest activities, those concerns should always be primary, the concerns on climate and credits, so that we can ensure that it becomes one of the main issues to address when talking about forest matters. And under Afolu, this would also include agriculture and livestock breeding, which would which would have significant impacts on emissions, and that could be worked through specific regulations under a trade system as well, establishing certain limits to their emissions, because then we would be talking about specific activities by source that we could control and monitor, and with the offsets program could compensate for. So to conclude, I would say that it's really important that in this preparation and this program design that we consider how to trade those emissions. As per the climate change law, the law establishes that we do have to address the matters as such. So we would have to connect that together with local efforts, regional efforts, and community level efforts, because it isn't just about thinking about how the program can incentivize emissions reductions or not, but also to see how results might be gained that would connect with the broader comprehensive climate change goals. This would include adaptation. This would include adopting science and technology. That is, it would allow us to be much more comprehensive in that sense. That would be it. Thank you so much, Jose Francisco. We do have a question from the audience that we'll try to answer now by all three of you. And it comes from Mauricio Mira, who is asking, one of the main issues is that the maximum price that is set through a tax has certain implications. How are you working on the auction systems in your countries to allow for dynamic pricing? And are you moving? And if you're moving in an emissions system, a cap and trade system, who should be the regulator for these commodity markets? Could we begin with you? And then we'll continue with Cyril and Jose Francisco. Okay, I can try to answer that question quickly. I think there are several things here. I think there's a difference between carbon pricing, or rather a carbon tax, and as a manner of de-incentivizing consumption. I think we have to be very clear in this regard. The carbon tax is to make consumption and fuel burning more expensive. That's one thing. And conversely, we do have a compliance system in place as far as the limits that have been set for emissions. But the key point in an emissions trade system is mitigation. It is not about doing business. Yes, you have to mitigate, and that mitigation should be financially feasible. Otherwise, well, it would never happen. So what I think should be clarified is that on one hand, the main goal of ETSs is to mitigate, and that mitigation make financial sense.
Hay diferentes esquemas. Una es la realización de esquemas de cumplimiento. Una es la realización de protocolos de
and that it be clear, and for that there are several systems. One is through offsetting protocols. That could be used to look at non-regulated sectors to develop projects that would bring other benefits around adaptation and feasibility and supporting sustainability and nature-based solutions, which undoubtedly provide synergies and interesting co-benefits in health and the environment that are sometimes not quantifiable, but they are there. So we'd have to see how that improves the conditions as far as the environment. And it's also really important to say that the limits to the systems are also really important. That is, you have to foster innovation, you have to foster productivity, you have to foster competitiveness without blocking industrial activities and without blocking commercial activities, but definitely with social and environmental responsibility to establish suitable limits. And that is really intense work. Studies have to be done, decisions have to be made, database decisions have to be made. So there's significant co-responsibility from the industrial sector, from the authorities, and from the productive sectors, of course, but also the social sector to develop projects and activities that would allow us to show the benefits of a system such as this, which is not strictly economic, but definitely does have to have an economic logic to it that would allow for activities towards mitigation. Thank you so much, Marco, for your response. And I'd like to now hear from Juan Pedro. Thank you so much. I think Marco gave an extremely comprehensive answer to the cap and trade system. I fully agree with what he said. I think there's a main difference between a cap and trade and cost effectiveness. It's a tax, like Marco was saying, that was designed to reduce the use of fossil fuels as much as possible, all the way down to zero even. And I think it is achieving a goal. In our case, and in the case of Mexico and Colombia, given the low amount to the tax, it's difficult. In our case, at least, it's difficult. We have not yet seen an impact as far as any change in behavior when comparing regulated sources versus as pertaining to maybe more clean methods. And it's not that it's impossible, but maybe it is really difficult to maybe achieve a $50, $60 price. That part might be difficult. I think Marco has really said it quite clearly. It has to be cost effective. Carbon pricing has to match social matters and environmental goals, of course. But with a tax, at least in Chile, I cannot envision a $60 tax. I mean, surely the industries, I would dare say that it might be possible, but looking at signals and looking at the industry preferring not to pay the tax and then making that behavioral change, that would be ideal. I think Mexico and Colombia are on the right path in that regard. And also, sorry, one last thing. I think it's super interesting that the question also involved auctions. I think it's really interesting to look at emissions auctions because in a way the government has more resources and that are resources that are different from what the taxes can provide. Taxes go into a general fund, so it's difficult to reassign those resources to mitigation action or what have you. Whereas, as I understand it, I'm not sure how legislation is in other countries, but an auction, an emissions auctions, could provide many funds to the government to reinvest in that same activity or to subsidize, no matter how many people like or hate that word, they would subsidize certain efforts for the transition that is needed, and that would be a closed cycle. Look at California and Quebec. It's worked extremely well there. So I'll stop there. Dr. Murillo. Thank you. Thank you, Juan Pedro. Jose Francisco, what is your take on this question now? Thank you so much. Yes, I do think that, well, Marco did provide a clear context as far as how the instruments are distinguished and also gave us a very clear view on the challenges that this entails. So, yes, the tax is one thing and the emissions trade system is another. These are two instruments that work towards very different goals, but they do connect with a common goal, and that goal is mitigation, greenhouse gas emissions mitigations. In the case of Colombia, for example, let's keep in mind that the carbon tax is a green tax. It is not like Marco was saying, it isn't about it's being used to mitigate fossil fuels through this tax. When establishing a tax, the tax is implemented to internalize the costs of these emissions, and that in a way can be reflected in the country's efforts. The tax exemption or the non-taxation mechanism leverages this effort to de-incentivize fossil fuels, and by having the companies take certain steps. So the costs are internalized through the tax, and again, the carbon tax in Colombia is progressive. It increases with use and over time. It is increasing and will even double over time. And since there is a tax exemption mechanism in place also, there can be a ceiling. And it's really important to keep in mind when we are talking about an offset system and a trade system, that would be different. The goal there would be to establish a cap and trade, as the term itself establishes. If I establish a cap to emissions, then I have to start to see what my sectors, what kind of capacity we can find in the sectors, and what cap each sector has. To see how far it might demand those emissions controls, what kind of ceiling there is, and then establish a price accordingly. This would be under a system where, again, those limits are established, and then the conditions are provided to see what kind of reduction or mitigation capacity is in place. And that would entail a different mechanism, because there it would be about de-incentivizing emissions and incentivize mitigation. So, for example, the challenge, or really something I should really point out, is that we really have to keep in mind how to establish those limits, how to leverage information and establish limits and establish benchmarks. We need a very high level, a very high technical level in establishing those values, because you can't just establish a cap outright. You have to analyze each sector, analyze the impacts that a cap would have, and then see how those things can connect with mitigation. That would be it. Thank you so much, Jose Francisco. And I also thank you. I also thank Marco and Juan Pedro for their excellent answers, which really speak well about what's happening in Latin America and allow us to see what's been happening in carbon markets. So I would see maybe three conclusions from this panel. One is that undoubtedly, in terms of complying with climate goals in Latin America, the various countries and their governments are using several instruments, including, of course, carbon pricing and carbon markets, both regulated and voluntary. There has been much innovation. Many pilot programs are being run in these countries. There are certain differences as far as the current status around public policy and mechanisms, but they're all aimed towards bringing in private sector resources. A second point from this has to do with the challenges to these processes, given the specifics of each country. But they have all been quite driven by the commitment to achieve this vision of having a decarbonized economy. There, the countries are seeing several possibilities around carbon pricing through each country's policies and subsidies and certain practices for determined sectors. But then there are other matters having to do more with the economies in these kinds of markets and how to incorporate economic, environmental, and social matters into these kinds of certifications, together with the technical challenges. That is, there's emphasis in improving record keeping and transparency. There's an emphasis also on improving reporting as it pertains to the quality of carbon markets in Latin America. And this, of course, confirms Latin America's leadership. And then there's a third point that I think I should point out, and that is that they all agree in that it's important to find ways of creating regional and sub-regional markets that would allow for harmonizing standards and harmonizing methodologies and sharing experiences. And to conclude, we see that it's clear that we need even more dialogue between countries to share experiences and to have horizontal assistance, because there's a lot to be learned from each other. So I thank you all very much for your interventions that were quite enriching. And we will now welcome the Vice Minister of Environment from Colombia, who is online with us, Dr. Galarza, who will be joining us very soon with a presentation on the Colombian case to give us some insights as far as achievements and challenges in Colombia. We've heard from Dr. Charri in a very enlightening way, but now we'd like to hear the presentation from the Vice Minister. Welcome, Vice Minister. Dear former Minister Luis Gilberto, it's a pleasure to greet you once again, together with all the panelists. Special greetings to you for these amazing discussions at the technical level for today. Before anything, I'd like to especially greet all of you and Minister Carlos Eduardo Correa unfortunately could not be called. He had a last-minute call from the president, so he had to excuse himself from this presentation. He was really eager to engage with all of you, and he reiterates the commitment that we have under President Duque's administration to continue on this path of innovation and to consolidate and make the carbon markets more dynamic and robust in Colombia. So we are quite pleased to be here engaging in this space over these 4 webinars. Today, we are on our second webinar, and we are convinced that this will definitely be a tool for exchanging ideas and for joint learning to move forward in the continental context, to learn best practices and in continuing with this major opportunity in terms of economic development and in terms of meeting our climate agendas. So should I begin with the presentation? I understand. Yes, please go ahead. You have the floor. Thank you so much. Okay. So if production could please place my presentation. I was told that you were going to share it. Could you confirm that, please? I think you're seeing it now. Is that right? Can you confirm that you can see it? Okay, great. So I do have a presentation for you today that somewhat summarizes what we've been working on in Colombia. I know that our climate change director has spoken of very specific subjects, but I'll be giving you a broader overview, speaking specifically about the initiatives and the progress that we've had in these 3 points you see on screen. Next, please. Next. So let's see. So this is specifically referring to how Colombia in the last 5 or 6 years has had significant progress with the creation of instruments such as the carbon tax, which was discussed. Here, I would also point out something else that was mentioned, and that is that Colombia, from the very beginning, did not establish a carbon tax as a mechanism for fundraising, but instead to an incentive to reduce greenhouse gases. And with that, the mechanism for non-taxation was also established, which would allow for companies subject to the tax to offset their emissions and thus tax exempt. The following create a specific framework for a voluntary market. And the following year, the actual law was passed. The law that establishes a mechanism for a non-voluntary, but for a mandatory market, rather, with the creation of a cap and trade system. And I'll be speaking very quickly about this market because we know that our audience is already quite versed on the subject. Next, please. I mean, I don't think you need me to tell you the difference between voluntary or regulated markets because of your broad experience, so I'll skip that part. And I think the previous slide really spoke to that. So next, please. So we do, again, have a voluntary market that was created based on a carbon tax together with non-causation. So let's talk about the carbon tax and the non-causation mechanism. Next, please. So the carbon tax, and our dear former minister Luis Gilberto knows this very well. The carbon tax came from a negotiation under the peace agreement, although the mechanism was not for financing. It was considered mostly for environmental matters, but with the carbon tax, certain deforestation would be mitigated, as well as payment for services, for environmental services, together with conserving protected areas. We just heard about the challenge in raising the amount for the tax. The tax in Colombia did include a mechanism for pricing, which after several adjustments is at around 17,000 pesos, so roughly $4 per ton. And this tax established a path for non-taxation through the various offsetting initiatives, where the offsets are verified and subsequently recorded into the national system, which in Colombia is known as the RENARE, R-E-N-A-R-E. In specific terms then, as I was saying, Colombia has adopted, under the regulated system, under the regulated market, rather, a cap and trade system, where it clearly shows that these offsets that could be traded are issued by the government to be traded in primary and secondary markets, and that would allow for incentives so that companies that are subject to these offsets can innovate so that they could ultimately have incentives for technology transformations that would be better as far as emissions. So Colombia is moving forward in regulating and in the technical the technical developments, together with various studies that would allow us to establish the tradable offsets, because this is especially important in post-COVID reactivation. Otherwise, it might not be feasible for the private sector. So let me speak briefly of some of the results, which I think are key figures that might provide a better understanding of what has been achieved to date. Next, please. So what have we achieved? Something that we have determined, and I think in many countries in Latin America, there is great potential for this in developing a new sector of the economy. Looking at what's been happening only in voluntary markets, we have found that upwards of 4,000 requests have been received for non-taxation, for non-causation. And this has entailed, and I'm sorry that I didn't put this up in English, or rather, I'm sorry I didn't put this in dollars, because we know we have an international audience. The exchange rate is $1 to 3,700 pesos, roughly. And in pesos, about 500 million pesos has been invested in the market through carbon market initiatives. From the creation of the markets, and sorry, we also changed. We changed the format here, and the layout is a little bit off. But ever since the tax has been in place, almost 50 million tons have been offsets. And that's why I really emphasize this message, that the tax is still being collected. That is, companies that are subject to the tax have decided to pay 1.6 billion pesos instead of opting for non-taxation. And through these initiatives, we do see a major opportunity for business. We know, and we've realized that, and we work to this effect, we know that we have to provide for development, for developing a certain experience and regulatory framework which is much so that the supply and demand can connect in a much better way. We would expect that there would be many more transactions and less tax collection, because in the end, and this is one of the main messages of the presentation, in the end, what we're seeking with this, just as Marco said in Mexico, is to, first of all, comply with our NDC. And to that, we have to make sure that we significantly increase that non-taxation so that there is less incentive to collect the actual tax, and thus creates incentives to protect our forests. In Latin America, again, there's great potential. Colombia is one of the countries that is considered to be a forest country. 57 million hectares of the 110 in the country are covered by forest. Here we have some calculations showing that from the forestry standpoint, Colombia might sequester some 88 million tons annually. So there's a potential here, a highly developed potential, and we are convinced that this will be one of the main tools to achieve the NDC. Over 90% of the non-taxation initiatives have come from the non-forestry sector. Showing the country's potential and showing that this can become a leverage point where the country might be able to move forward decidedly in the fight against deforestation. And in greenhouse gas emissions, a follow in greenhouse gas emissions is quite significant. On the global average, deforestation contributes 11% to the global inventory. However, in Colombia, it's triple that. 33% is the share of greenhouse gas emissions from in the accounting here. So this is one of the main initiatives, and this is why we have decidedly established an alternative that addresses two fronts. One, on making the voluntary market much more dynamic, and to consolidate our regulated market. Next, please. So we've been working quite closely with the private sector in that regard. We know that they are the ones who are structuring projects. Next, please. They're the ones who are structuring the projects. And we've been building a pathway together. You can see here, and this is something really specific now to the Colombian market, but I think it can provide some insights as far as what things are being requested of us. One is to clarify roles. Another is to systematize processes and their enforcement. Also to dive deeper in public-private partnerships, to improve our local registration process, to diversify mitigation initiatives, because again, we have a high concentration of forestry in our country, to ensure information. If we want to have a dynamic market, we need to democratize access to information. As it is today, we have an archaic system, and that's why I'll be telling you about this in the next slide, where we are proposing a new platform. So our initiatives right now are the following. We have identified at least the need to adjust 9 regulations and 9 standards, which again would aim at 4 specific issues: to improve the registration of transactions, to avoid double accounting, etc., to regulate the various standards in Colombia with international and local standards, to adjust the clean development mechanism, which was kind of the first mechanism, together with verifying the registry. And in Colombia, one very important point, to incorporate the Cancun safeguards to establish social and ethical standards that would protect the communities, the indigenous communities, and others who oftentimes inhabit and have jurisdiction over these areas. We're also moving forward in establishing a marketplace so that we can connect more efficiently the supply and demand and have cleaner transactions. Today, we're working on an over-the-counter system which doesn't really facilitate access. And since we want to incentivize offset creation in citizens and other voluntary efforts, and even abroad, having a platform and a marketplace that a responsible company or citizen wants to engage in, they should be able to do so. And that's why I mentioned that we have installed from the start of this year an institutional working group on carbon, convening 42 stakeholders, many from the private sector, unions, trade groups, and partner organizations, together with Aso Carbono, where sub-technical working groups have also been established in turn to dive deeper into those discussions around the mechanism and the RED Plus projects, together with others. So I'll close by thanking you once again. I understand the importance of this space in convening our partners from the private sector, such as Aso Carbono, YETA, and USAID, who have been our major partners in developing this mechanism. We see that there's a quite robust agenda in place for us. We want to continue in this innovation that Colombia has set forth and become more dynamic in the regional context based on the competitive advantage that our country has in forestry, but also in structuring many of these emissions offsetting programs and carbon markets to, again, achieve our NDC in the medium and short term, ideally, which would help us towards carbon neutrality as we've set forth for 2050, and that this allow us to enable that productive transformation that the country has ahead. That's one of the main initiatives that we have under President Duque's administration. The administration ends in August of next year, so we hope to leave all of this that I've mentioned in place, in operation, together with other efforts that would require further work. So I thank you all very much. The Colombian government reiterates its commitment together with this ministry. We know that with the leadership of Minister Carlos Correa, we will achieve a much more dynamic market with other kinds of innovation that will benefit us in developing this new sector of the economy in Colombia. Thank you. Thank you very much, Vice Minister Nicolas Caraza. My dear public official, your presentation was quite clear and was quite enriching to this event. We will now go on to our second panel, comprised of a group of very interesting countries, Dominican Republic, Brazil, and Panama. Joining us is Natalie Flores, the Director of Climate Change under the Vice Ministry of Cooperation in Dominican Republic. Joining us is also Marta Dianichi, who's the Director of the Department of Forest Conservation in Brazil, and also Ligia Castro, the Director of Climate Change in Panama. I thank you very much for your participation and for presenting your experiences. And I will be asking just a couple of questions, reminding you that we have about 30 minutes to go for these questions. And I'll remind all the attendees that you can also send in your questions through the chat. First, a general question. What is the current status of the carbon markets in your countries? And what kind of internal and external challenges are you facing into the future to consolidate these markets, considering their contributions towards social, environmental, and financial goals? And to not repeat the question exactly, I'd like to ask that you respond in this order. First, Natalie Flores, then Marta Gianichi, and then we'll close with Ligia Castro. Welcome. Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Murillo. It's a pleasure to be able to be here with you and all of our colleagues in Latin America. Longtime friends, and also very admirable professionals. In the case of Dominican Republic, the current situation in our country is that, well, we are strengthening our frameworks to provide the Dominican society with carbon markets and voluntary carbon markets, registries, and everything else. Currently, we are at a stage in which the country has begun in these efforts, and actually began about 10, 11 years ago, to make the country more robust and to change our economic model. However, despite these institutional arrangements geared towards climate change and climate initiatives, given our geographic location and our status as a peninsula shared with another country, everything that we've done is really towards addressing those issues around our global emissions, and however, our country still has not achieved the goals that it set out. And in considering our NDC, which was updated and improved in December of 2020, we are now having the country embark on a green post-COVID recovery. And one of the main points for this is carbon markets. In that regard, what we've done uh, is to address climate change through our institution together with greenhouse gas emissions caps under our development. And in fact, this will undergo a 10-year review as of next year to increase our ambition as far as emissions reductions. And with that, we will incorporate the private sector, and we're inviting the private sector to engage in all of these efforts to achieve the sustainability that Dominican Republic has not been able to achieve thus far. And why have we not been able to achieve it? Because it entails a transformation of the private sector. And that transformation will only take place when it becomes profitable. That's why we see carbon markets as one way to get there. However, given our social, economic, and environmental goals, Dominican Republic does need to make some institutional arrangements by establishing certain measures that would obligate our system to comply through a voluntary carbon market. Thank you so much, Nathalie. Marta, welcome.
Agradeço o convite. Vou falar em português. Acredito que vocês podem acionar aí o tradutor.
Good morning to all of you. I would like to thank you for the invitation. I'm going to speak in Portuguese. This is an international event and we have translators so that you can understand. For those friends who speak Spanish, our friends, that way you can understand a bit my Portuguese. I would like to thank one more time the presence of all of you and the attention of all the ones that are here listening to this webinar about this such an important subject as it is the carbon markets. On the side of Brazil, the current status of the carbon markets, there was a re-strengthening of this market based on different actions from the Ministry of Environment in this action. In previous administrations in carbon voluntary markets, it was not an initiative that was supported by the federal government that was in power in that time. So there was even certain legal uncertainty in regards to carbon voluntary markets. So starting from the management that started in 2019, and due to the importance that this management gave to the carbon markets as well as the environmental services payment, we developed a regulatory frame or some norms that allowed to re-strengthen that market. So based on a resolution that the Ministry of Environment issued in a group that we have, which is called CONEHETSIS, which is the instance that makes the decisions related to the core carbon markets network, there a resolution started that simply had, I'd say, as an end, the support and strengthening the voluntary carbon market, especially in regards to the forestry economy, and an important mean in order to change the logic of deforestation directly in our territories. So we believe that the potential of this market is a large potential, is a huge potential, which started from this resolution, we identified that many of the projects and many of the initiatives related to the forestry carbon markets that were asleep woke up. So we believe in this. We believe in a key market to take investments to the deforestation and reforestation centers, keeping all the necessary safeguards. And in regards to regulated markets in Brazil, we're waiting for some definitions that probably will have at the end of a year with the COP26 to understand how Article 6 will be applied in agreements that we have in multilateralism in countries. We believe that the future has different modalities of actions to attract money for the forests and to change that logic of deforestation.
Buen día, muchísimas gracias por la invitación a Panamá. Como ustedes saben, Panamá es un país carbono negativo. El reto que tenemos
carbon
es
negative. The
hacer todo
challenge
lo
we
posible
have
por llegar
is
al
to do as much as
2050
possible
como
to
carbono negativo.
get to
En ese
2050
sentido, los 10 compromisos nacionales
as a carbon negative country.
compromisos determinados nacionalmente que tenemos, para cada uno de ellos queremos
Therefore,
lograr
we have
la carbono
established an
neutralidad.
NDC to achieve carbon
Estamos en
neutrality,
un proceso de
and we are
expansión y
in
de
the process
fortalecimiento de
of
las
expanding and
capacidades
strengthening
del equipo
capacity
técnico a
in the
cargo
technical team
del nivel institucional, tanto de
here
la
at the
Dirección de
institution
Cambio Climático,
under
como a
the
ser
climate change
transversal en las
office,
otras
but also
direcciones del ministerio
in
y en
other
los
offices
otros
under the
ministerios
ministry
de la
and other
gestión pública.
ministries
Y
under public
brevemente
administration.
contamos con los arreglos institucionales en
We are
proceso
also
de
making
revisión y
institutional
firma del decreto
arrangements
ejecutivo que establece
to
las bases
establish the executive
sobre
decree
el
that would
mercado
establish
nacional de
the
carbono del país.
foundation
Hemos
for the carbon
lanzado
market in
el programa
Panama.
Reduce tu Huella Corporativo,
We
que ya
launched
cuenta con
the
62 empresas
Reuse Your
registradas
Corporate
para
Footprint
reducir su
program,
huella de carbono a
consisting of
nivel
32 companies that
organizacional.
have committed to reduce their carbon
26
footprint
organizaciones de
institutionally.
estas ya están
26 of
comprometidas
these
con
organizations
carbono
have already
neutralidad
made a
para el
commitment
2050.
to carbon
Y
neutrality by
suscritas la
2050.
declaratoria de las 50
And
primeras
they
empresas que le haremos un
uh,
reconocimiento el próximo año.
and these
Estamos
first 50
ya
companies to engage in this will be
Reduce tu Huella
recognized as such in the coming year.
corporativo tenemos el
In,
estándar técnico
in
ya
reducing the corporate
elaborado y su
footprints,
herramienta
we
de
have the technical
cálculo
framework already
de
created,
carbono, que
together with
estará
the carbon
disponible
calculation
en la
tool, which will
plataforma de
be made
transparencia
available
climática que para el mes de octubre
in
ya
the
la
climate
tendremos
change website
en línea
that
y
will be
que
in
pueda
operation in
ser
October,
revisada por todos en Panamá y fuera de Panamá. Los
which can
retos
then be used by all
internos
of
y
Panama and
externos
beyond
es
Panama.
poner en marcha los
As far as
8
internal and external
instrumentos
challenges,
reduce
we
tu
have
huella
yet to
previstos en el decreto ejecutivo que ya
engage with the
tenemos
other companies under
para
the
fijar
Reduce
las
Your Carbon
bases del
Footprint
mercado de
initiative
carbono. Estos son la
to
reducción de
establish
huella de
the
carbono
carbon
en
markets.
proyectos, en productos,
So this would be about
en
reducing carbon
municipios,
footprints in
en
projects, in
eventos, en
products, in
turismo,
municipalities,
en
in
marítimo,
events,
en
in
aéreo
tourism,
y en
in
logística.
maritime matters, in
El
aerial
sistema
matters,
también
and
el
in
sistema de
logistics.
monitoreo y seguimiento a las empresas
The
y
monitoring
organizaciones
and
que se
evaluation
incluyeron
system
ya
for
en el
companies and
programa Reduce
organizations
tu Huella, como
will
la
also be
primera
used for the
fase,
companies in the
del
Reduce Your
mercado en
Footprint program
creación de la
as part of the
paridad.
first phase of the
Articulación entre
creation
los tres actores clave entonces
of
del
the market
mercado.
by addressing
Reduce tu
demand
huella con el
and by
sistema de
addressing the key stakeholders.
compensaciones y con los
This is being done with
recargadores
Reduce Your
de
Footprint,
Panamá,
the
que
Reduce Your Footprint
tenemos
program,
prevista que pueda ya
and
estar operando
the
el
Panama
próximo año
stock
en la
market,
Bolsa de Valores de Panamá.
which
Muchas gracias.
and Panama carbon market, which would be under the stock market in Panama as of next year. Thank you so much. And I'd like to now address some specific questions per country, and we can begin with Natalie from Dominican Republic. We know that Dominican Republic signed an agreement with the World Bank this last May to reduce carbon emissions and reduce deforestation. What is the role of the private sector under that agreement with the World Bank? And what kind of efforts will be made towards carbon markets in that regard? Thank you so much. Well, first of all, our administration changed. And what we've done now is to evaluate the processes to provide continuity to those processes. Since we have environmental experience where there have been issues in continuity for other programs under climate change, we are now really addressing how to make these programs last through the 10 years that we have agreed to under the agreement. Specifically to your question, this is our very first experience as Dominican Republic, where we will be experimenting with this market, and the private sector's role would consist of participative processes around carbon neutrality for forest as established by the convention. So the private sector producers belonging to such industries must achieve an emissions reductions by performing specific change activities, and this would include forest conservation and protected areas, community engagement, addressing deforestation, sustainable forest management, producing cocoa in the shade, producing coffee in the shade, and other initiatives. In that sense, the roles and commitments under the commitments are the following. First, to identify and work with the federations and associations together with other organized groups to achieve the mitigation goals in the field directly, and by formalizing agreements between the Dominican Republic and others to engage in a program, and issuing emission certificates as per the framework. A few relevant points on offsetting. One is that specific actions must be taken based on the directives under the social and environmental system under the program. That is, in compliance with the social and environmental principles that are in place, and to enforce reporting mechanisms based on procedures that were established under the Office of the Ministry of Environment here, under the Climate Change Office. And this would include reporting on environmental and social matters. As you know, the Cancun safeguards and other measures are quite relevant in this field. I have two more points to mention. As far as distributing benefits derived from offsets, using verified and reported emissions, together with reporting on the monitoring of the guidelines that have been established for them. And lastly, the sector must engage in the decision-making for future efforts. And for this, several offices have been established to address these matters with these industries. Thank you so much. Marta, this question is for you. Recently, the Ministry of Environment in Brazil launched the Floresta Cruz program, and in this new version of the program, it included solid central benefits to the voluntary market that are bringing in the private sector in the country, which is really important. Could you tell us what is the Floresta Plus program and what are the main benefits and opportunities for voluntary carbon markets in Brazil?
I brought a presentation to visually understand the Florestan Plus program. On the screen, I'm going to show I think that's the one from Mexico. It's that one. So recently, the Ministry of Environment launched the Floresta Plus program. You can go to the next one. The Floresta Plus program is a specific action of the Ministry of Environment which has an object to promote environmental services, recognizing and assessing the environmental activities performed and encouraging its monetary retribution and non-monetary contribution. The exclusive focus is in the vegetation native area in the Brazilian biomas. So what is exactly the Floresta Plus program? Here we're putting as a concept the program that the environmental services are clear activities that are executed by people or by families or by groups or by companies, by governments or project managers. So there is a side of a human being that changes the activity. Activities that end up in the protection and recovery of a native vegetation. We promoted this logic in order to be able to bring a clear policy that could incentivize people. We noticed that, for instance, if you think a bit in the context of the Amazon itself, where you have 25 million people who are inhabiting in that area, there is a human development that's very below the normal indexes. They're extreme poverty indexes. So bringing environmental services under the scope of the individuals that are performing these activities, we can develop public policies and we can take quality of life, better employment and better revenues for these people. So these activities performed by people who end up in a clear benefit for the ecosystem: monitoring, surveillance, protection, struggle against fires, recapture of native vegetation, and all those activities end up in the preservation of water and inventories of or the reduce of carbon. So as a government, what we're seeking is the participation of the private sector in these activities. The participation of the private sector remunerating those who execute the environmental services. And what is the market that we're mentioning? It's different sectors that have an interface with a native species: financial sectors, oil and gas, pharmaceutical industry, power sector, water production sector, or distribution sector. We believe that these people who work in vital services that are executing these activities are going to guarantee an improvement in their employment and in their revenues. In the Floresta Plus program, with this concept, is an umbrella program which covers or encompasses different initiatives, and one of these initiatives is Floresta Plus Carbon, which is what we were talking about here. You can go to the next slide because I'm a little bit of a behind on time. So below the Floresta Plus program, we have Floresta Plus Carbon program, which is an activity that promotes the voluntary carbon activity, which is included within the Floresta Plus carbon market. Besides the clear signaling of the federal government that the voluntary carbon market is a very important initiative for the development, it's the appetizer. We're also we're foreseeing the design of a platform where we're going to cover all these initiatives related to the voluntary market. So what are the structuring stages that we're thinking of for the consolidation? So first of all, we issued a decree in Brazil, which was the reduced emissions for carbon projects in forest areas. So basically, the private forestry carbon were not considered within the network theme, and now they're considered, and we formalized that importance. We launched the program of payment for environmental services of Floresta Plus. We recognize the voluntary carbon service as a solution, and we launched this as a decree from the Ministry of Environment, and we formalized the economic activity of forestry preservation within the National Code of Economic Activities that we have in Brazil, which is called KINAI. Now, starting from that formalization, people who practice or perform preservation activities can issue invoices and can celebrate that formalization, and also including other initiatives. We've been structuring them to consolidate the voluntary carbon market. So the concept of Floresta Plus carbon is that carbon is not an environmental asset, but it is a performance index, is a performance indicator that the environmental services of protection, monitoring, surveillance, struggle against fires, and recovery are having as an outcome the capture of carbon. So it's a performance indicator of two projects. That's our interpretation of Floresta Plus carbon. So in order to guarantee here all the environmental integrity addressed to voluntary carbon programs, we have been acting with the design of a platform for registration of voluntary carbon market projects, where we're going to register everything so that as negotiation progress, we can think of possible manners of harmonizing these carbon credits in order to make a transition for the voluntary market. And I'm going to finish my talk, not to spend more of your time. And thank you very much. Thanks, Mark.
Creating these products and services that are sustainable and resilient based on the country's goal towards carbon neutrality. What kind of implementation pathway has been in place for that, and how do you plan on strengthening regional cooperation? Yes, like I was saying initially, we are already executing the executive decree that created the Reduce Your Footprint program. And we are also working on updating the regulations for Kutikwetao, so that, or rather, the initiatives for product labeling, so that all products that reduce their footprints are identified as such in the carbon markets, and in their labeling, they can state how much their carbon footprint has been reduced. This is both for the domestic market, but also for products that are exported internationally. We are also working on updating the environmental impact studies methodologies that would include the risk and vulnerability to climate change by prioritizing nature-based solutions that would in turn include carbon sequestration and include the carbon footprint estimates for each project, which would then define what their compensation would look like. This will be monitored during the project's execution, and will be consolidated at the end of the project. And we are also working on the law for climate change, which would allow for the executive decrees that I've mentioned, the executive decree for the Reduce Your Footprint program, the decree that establishes the carbon market, which is about to be approved, and the labeling regulations, together with the environmental studies initiatives, all of that would be covered under the climate change law. And we also have to consider other things that would allow us to further strengthen the carbon markets once it is established as of next year. We have been working on regional cooperation by learning from other countries in Latin America, in South-South cooperation, for which we have had many exchanges. And we have also had many exchanges with the carbon market in California, so that we will be able to leverage all the support being provided by the countries into the near future when we make more progress in consolidating the national carbon markets, and to then share our lessons learned in turn. Thank you so much, Ligia. And to wrap up this panel, I would like to thank you all very much for your answers, but I did have one question from the audience that I'd like for you to answer, and I'll remind you that you have maybe 2 or 3 minutes to answer. The question is, if carbon markets can drive the adaptation market in a region, because really the goal is around mitigation. So could you give us or share with us some specific cases where adaptation is more central? Sure, I'm happy to answer that. And in fact, this is why we are broadly using nature-based solutions for our initiatives. That allows us on one hand to adapt, but on the other also to continue to increase our capacity to sequester emissions in Panama. In terms of the pandemic, The goal is mitigation, although that is yet not achieved. We are moving forward, however. And adaptation is the way we have been able to move forward. In fact, the best adaptation possible comes through mitigation. Thank you so much, Ligia. Natalie, if you'd like to answer the question as well. Yes, I think the question is actually pretty timely because in Dominican Republic, together with French cooperation, the AFD, and with the support of colleagues in the region that also address these issues, we are addressing the framework to finance adaptation and to provide possibilities to the market through adaptation. Together with what I mentioned previously, our institutional arrangements in adapting to climate change. With this, we are establishing a precedent through mitigation actions in the agricultural sector in reducing their emissions. And to that, any credits that we create through there will bring us closer to that goal. Thank you so much. Marta?
Você pode repetir a pergunta para mim, por favor, Luiz?
Sí, la pregunta nos dice que si pueden compartir ejemplos de proyectos del mercado de carbono que potencien la adaptación, porque el enfoque que persiste es un enfoque de mitigación o que obviamente potencien ambas.
Nosotros, como con el papel del gobierno federal, nosotros no solamente
We, as our government role, we not only encourage the voluntary forest carbon market which aim to stock flow projects, but also we have a support line to adaptation plans with ovens. We have those ovens which are made by forest flags. Consequently, we have a support line and an alliance with some initiatives that are done in the countryside to adjust those ovens to use less flags and do more efficient ovens. Because there are many people in Brazil that still use rudimentary stoves and too much firewood. So, we have a support line of those projects that are directly used in the territory to do that adaptation part in the international cooperation field, thinking about the strategies of the federal government according to the Articulation Ministry of Environment and with other ministries. We also have the Secretariat of Climate and International Relations, which go hand in hand with Ministry of Economy, Science and Technology to develop some initiatives aimed at adaptation projects. Based on that, here we have a fairly active agenda in that way.
This panel has been quite enriching, thanks to your contributions from Dominican Republic, Brazil, and Panama. Very significant contributions, and we were able to hear from all of you. And together with the first panel with Mexico, Chile, and Colombia, and Vice Minister's presentation, all this allows us to conclude many things. I would emphasize initially the fact that the ambition that every country has established, together with more private sector engagement, has made it so that efforts are coming together towards those commitments, those nationally determined commitments. That has really driven the carbon markets in the region, or nationally determined contributions, which have really driven carbon markets in the region. And we've seen this here today. There are many pilot programs being developed in the countries at the project level, at the regional level, at the national level, through these public-private partnerships. But also, obviously there are challenges. And many of these challenges have to do with implementing new systems together with the progress and the pathways that the countries have defined for themselves in terms of the need of engaging different instruments, different economic instruments that would allow for moving forward towards the respective climate goals that each country and the region is committed to. And there I find a significant challenge. In terms of, in technical terms, there are challenges, especially when referring to record keeping and monitoring, verification and reporting, where methodologies have to be brought forward to establish a harmonization for the region, and then continuing in this openness when looking at other experiences and best practices that we are finding in the various countries. I think that point is extremely key, as we've seen here today. And there's also a challenge in being able to engage that horizontal cooperation further, given the various experiences that we found in the private sector and in the government and in the communities in these countries. I see a very important emphasis in acknowledging the need in a region such as Latin America that has 50% of the biodiversity and where 40% of the territories in the region are inhabited by indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants and tribal peoples. There's great interest in, of course, safeguarding their well-being, but also in seeing how carbon markets can improve the conditions in these communities. In addition to providing co-benefits around protecting biodiversity, not only in addressing the climate crisis, but also for biodiversity reasons. I think here, as we can conclude from the panels, we have also established a very significant path to move forward in consolidating markets, domestic markets, together with the task of better distributing information and better offering information as far as how these markets operate at the subnational level, but also in consolidating markets in the region and even in sub-regions, such as under the Pacific Alliance. There, I see that there are agreements in place from what we've heard here to move forward in that regard. Now, how to move forward there, that also entails a challenge in having the countries sit down and come to agreements, because the active listening and conversation in Latin America almost always depends on external stakeholders to the region. Hence the role of USAID and associations such as Asocarbono and IETA that can bring the region together and truly allow for that exchange of experiences between countries. And what is clearest of all is that the region is well positioned to continue to lead in consolidating and expanding carbon markets, and that the region is responding with regulatory frameworks that are suitable, and obviously will need much technical assistance and support to establish that integration with the private sector to achieve the goal that the Vice Minister said, achieve the goal under the commitments that have been assumed by each country. And all the panelists agreed in that local experimentation has to continue, but there's also much experience to be gained from other countries, hence the importance of that engagement. And also that one must be quite attentive to the negotiations and agreements that are being established under COP26 as per Article 6 of the Paris Accord. That will be a definitive factor which will establish the way forward for the region in leveraging these 21st century markets. I'd like to conclude with these general takeaways, and by obviously thanking all of our panelists, Vice Minister Galarza as well. And I would invite now Ana Milena to give us some closing words for this event. Thank you, Luis Gilberto. Yes, thank you so much. Also, thanks to the Vice Minister of Environment, to USAID, IETA, and Azúcar Bueno for organizing this event, but especially to all of you for having engaged in this event. In general, the event today showed us the importance of bilateral cooperation, as we heard from Dominican Republic and other countries, together with cooperating countries. And we've seen that carbon markets are efficient, financially speaking, that are increasingly gaining strength and becoming more suitable in addressing climate change. We are now also in a setting where consumers are demanding more climate-conscious products. Hence the importance of engaging in these initiatives to coexist with the various ecosystems. In Chile, carbon neutrality by 2023 will allow for strengthening local capacity to properly manage these initiatives under carbon markets. We saw that in Mexico, there are also many initiatives in place to reduce emissions by 2030, and we are eagerly expecting, in turn, that the Panama markets will become significant in reducing carbon footprints, and we're happy to hear that efforts are being made in that regard. Colombia is prepared to engage in offsets and other kinds of projects to align with its national accounting system. And private investment in Colombia, based on the data provided from Vice Minister Nicolas Galarza, has allowed for creating over 50 million allowances in the carbon market, representing upwards of $130 million. And that is how Colombia is now very privileged in its position by having robust regulations in place that would allow it to continue to lead in the region and to show, by example, how emissions can be reduced through these mechanisms. We invite you to our next seminar, which will be on August 18th, called Commitments by the Private Sector in Latin America, together with the other programs we have scheduled, all leading to the Climate Summit in Latin America, which will be done in the city of Cartagena, Colombia, on the 6th, 7th, and 8th of October 2021. Looking at carbon markets in Latin America, monitoring and verification and compliance with the Paris Accord, the challenges that countries are facing in aligning with jurisdictional programs, and especially looking at the opportunities that these markets offer for financial inclusion. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.